Hi everyone, welcome to our training today. Today we'll be talking about sleep supports and strategies for children with autism and related disorders. My name is Marissa Eck. I'm a behavior analyst at the L's for Autism Foundation, and I'm excited to present this training for you today. As a reminder, this is a CEU accredited course, so make sure that you're listening closely and waiting for those magic words that will be embedded in the training in order to get your CEUs for attending. All right, I will cue you when I'm going to share that information. Make sure you write them down and have them for future reference. Okay, here are our learning objectives for today's training. Attendees will identify the characteristics of good sleep. That sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like, of course, I know what good sleep is, but you'd be surprised. Attendees will gain a general understanding of common sleep issues and their causes in children. Attendees will determine good versus bad sleep dependencies and address environmental modifications. Attendees will review how to create and implement a structured bedtime routine with or without visual aids. And lastly, attendees will learn about different evidence-based sleep strategies that can be implemented at home. So something I want to mention before we continue are some special considerations. There is no one-size-fits-all sleep intervention. Today, I will be discussing general sleep strategies that the research shows to support children of all ages and cognitive abilities. I will take account of the atypical development of some of our learners and be sensitive to those. Some sleep cycles are abnormal for a variety of reasons. Some of our learners might have medical conditions that prevent them from having consistent sleep patterns. Some of our learners might be taking some sort of medication or sleep aid, and they may be limited with how much physical activity they can participate in during the day, and therefore that may be affecting how sleepy they can get at night. With all that being said, I have to put this out there. I'm not a medical professional, nor does L's for Autism have the ability to talk about medical needs, as we are not medical professionals, we are behavior analysts. So ethically, that's out of our scope of practice. So if there are any questions about medical concerns So for those learners that might have some of the concerns that are below, I do advise you to connect with your medical professional, your pediatrician, to talk about any type of medical concerns you might have and any sleep aids you want to explore. Okay? So let's discuss some prevalence of pediatric sleep disturbance. 35 to 50% of typically developing children have issues falling asleep or waking up in the morning. 63 to 73% of children with special needs have the same issues. That's a much higher statistic. Few children outgrow these sleep issues. A supervisor of mine a long time ago mentioned, bigger bodies, bigger problems, and that always stuck with me. And that is really relevant here in the sense that our learners, if they're not directly taught to do so, their problems may grow bigger as they grow bigger, as their brains begin to develop, as their bodies begin to develop. So if these things go untreated, unfortunately, they do not just outgrow them. One study found that 84% of babies with sleep problems still experience problems 3 years later. Sleep prevalence and disturbance with sleep is also associated with significant effects on family, in which we're going to highlight a little later on, but most importantly, parental and family stress, and sometimes often depression. Persistent sleep problems in childhood are also associated with childhood obesity, adolescent and emotional problems, anxiety in adulthood, and sleep problems through adulthood. So why is sleep so important? This is one of those questions that I'm sure come up all the time in your head of like, I know sleep is important because my body just does it regularly, but why is it so important? Well, for our learners, it's extra important to remember all of these things. So for us, sleep is restorative. Doesn't matter who you are biologically, we are built to sleep and rest our bodies, right? So without restorative sleep, children are more likely to be more irritable, more easily fatigued, more likely to suffer from unintentional injury or be a little bit more less aware of their body and space and maybe be labeled as clumsy, less likely to learn academic concepts, less likely to follow instructions, more likely to engage in challenging behavior, and more likely to engage in stereotypic behavior. So here we have a fun visual of the importance of sleep. Sleep is important for recovery the night after you exercise, so our bodies can heal. Sleep is essential for our immune system. Studies show that people who get more sleep may perform better in school, and the more sleep you get, the easier it is to focus, right? So these are just some other fun facts about sleep. Again, what is good sleep? So the National Sleep Foundation suggests that just the ability to fall asleep contributes to good sleep, which I think for many people can be a challenge. And for a lot of our learners, just the ability to fall asleep naturally. Staying asleep through the night. Minimal movement throughout the night. Minimal night awakenings. Waking up without too much trouble in the morning and not feeling too drowsy throughout the day. Those all contribute to what is considered good sleep. Again, by the National Sleep Foundation, it should take between 1 to 2 minutes of hitting the pillow to fall asleep. That does sound pretty fast, but that is what they would qualify as good sleep. However, a common and acceptable delay to fall asleep is somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes, and anything longer than that, past 20 minutes, would be considered problematic. You may then be getting into the habit of practicing not being asleep when and where you should be sleeping. So inadvertently, you're pairing the bed with being awake, which then can create an association with non-sleep related behaviors. I know for myself, sometimes I associate my bed with reading or being on my phone or my computer, and those are all things that will prevent me from falling asleep quickly. So just something to consider. So also the impact of daytime sleepiness in children, right? Sometimes we focus so heavily on getting them to sleep, getting our learners to get to sleep because nighttime feels really, really hard. But in a way, in many ways, if we can't get our learners to successfully have stabilized sleep at night, it's going to then affect the next day. So it's this ripple effect. So if our learners are having a hard time sleeping at night, we may see an increase in some behavioral issues like non-compliance during the day, aggression, hyperactivity, maybe poor impulse control. And then there's some neurocognitive deficits that might be impeded by daytime sleepiness in our learners. So they may be less likely to pay attention, they may be struggling to concentrate, they may be struggling to retrieve memories, and it's going to affect executive functioning, which means their planning and organizational skills if they're super sleepy throughout the day. So here are some common sleep problems. We hear nighttime routine non-compliance, sleeping interfering behaviors, or behaviors that occur after you've said goodnight, delayed sleep onset, night awakenings, and early awakenings. So our learners who are waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and not falling back asleep, or some learners who wake up every half hour after they've been put to bed. Delayed onset sleep is what we talked about earlier. It's falling asleep, not being able to fall asleep within that 15 to 20 minute delay successfully. It's delaying the onset of sleep. And interfering behaviors are things we are going to highlight as we're going on in this training, specific to sleep avoidant behaviors. And here are some common sleep concerns from parents that I've received and from the families that I've worked with in the past, where these are the things that have come up in parental language, in caretaker language, that I felt like were really important to highlight. So whether you're supporting a family who is struggling with stabilizing sleep, or you are a parent who is struggling to stabilize sleep for your child, I hope that this rings to be familiar territory for you. So my child does not want to go to sleep when I want them to go to sleep. Number one problem that I'm hearing when I do sleep consults for families. My child will not sleep through the night, but will take naps during the day. We are not going to be discussing naps in depth today. but naps are, just as a blanket statement, naps are okay as long as they are not impeding nighttime sleeping. That's going to be my message about naps for today. And we can always talk about that. If you have questions, you could always send me an email and we can talk further about napping. Okay, my child will not go to bed without a circus beforehand. I like the word circus because one time a parent said that she felt like she was doing everything possible. Her child was like, I want a glass of water. No, that water's too cold. No, this water's too warm. I want milk. I want 5 minutes more of this book. No, I want this book. And she felt like she was just like running a circus, putting on a show just to get her child to go to sleep. There's other kiddos who are super active at nighttime. Some learners who won't sleep in their own room or want to sleep with the parent or caretaker. My child might be having sleep terrors. Again, I'm not going to be highlighting sleep terrors in this training, but that sleep terrors are things that you want to communicate with your medical professional or pediatrician. Lastly, my child screams and cries until I go into the room and I sleep next to them. So these are all things that I've heard before, and you might be thinking yourself, or you might be considering for the family that you're supporting. I just want you to keep in mind that these are common sleep concerns that are happening across the board. So sleep problems can have a ripple effect, right? So lasting effects on the family and caregivers who are living with these learners. Parents and caregivers express feeling under siege in their own home, that they're feeling that they're walking on eggshells. Parents and caregivers and siblings can develop their own sleep problems in this ripple effect. They may feel extreme exhaustion and irritability. It also, in some cases, there is an effective erosion of the parent relationship with each other and their children, and daytime sleepiness, which can lead to additional issues. So sometimes I hear, most often I hear, how did we get here? How did we get to this point of having sleep problems? So there are so many causes for shifts in sleep patterns and sleep problems. This is most certainly not an exhaustive list, but this is somewhere we can begin. So vacations or long periods out of school can definitely throw off a sleep schedule. Definitely a pandemic can throw off a sleep schedule. A change in expectations of what school's going to look like can change a sleep schedule. An unexpected vacation or a surprise vacation or a trip in a new environment can affect a sleep schedule. Also, if a learner was sick, sometimes if our learners are sick, we want to comfort them, of course, so we allow them to sleep in our beds or we sleep close to them, and then things may change. A new living situation may definitely affect sleep patterns. Some of our learners aren't always comfortable in a new space, and or there are some learners who have always had a difficulty with sleep due to different changes in their routine or environment or some additional factors. There's those biological factors that you, again, will talk to your medical professionals about. We have some learners who have hyperactivity, and again, medication that might disrupt sleep. So those are things, again, to consider when thinking about a sleep intervention, because those are always going to be important to rule out first before you move forward with an intervention. So as a behavior analyst, we are always looking at behavior through a conceptual analysis. So here I'm going to take you through how I do that, or how we do that. So behavioral quietude is a fun way of saying falling asleep. And that is the behavior of interest that we choose here. So it can be influenced by past and present events in one's sleeping environment. It can be motivated or demotivated, can become reliant on environmental cues, can be affected by other reinforcers for behavior available at night. So we're looking at sleep through the lens of a contingency analysis, right? We're looking at MO, motivation, we're looking at SD, signal, we're looking at what the behavior is, and we're looking at reinforcement. There's also something called an open-ended indirect assessment that can be used, called the Sleep and Assessment Treatment Tool, SAT, and here is a link for that if you wanted to use that to conceptually conduct an analysis of sleep issues. So as an example, if we're gonna, let's come up with an example here. If I'm working with a family and a learner, a family has shared with me that their learner is having a really hard time and especially is demonstrating a lot of sleep avoidant behaviors. So what I would then do is collect some data, right? So we're going to try to understand what is the motivation for that learner to avoid sleep. What is the function? Why are they trying to avoid sleep or delay sleep? And we're going to look at what is the motivation. Are they deprived of something? Are they getting too much of something? What is the behavior at hand? So what behaviors would operationally define sleep avoidance? Are they running out of their room? Are they throwing toys? Are they having a tantrum? And then how are we reacting? How is the environment informing that behavior? So that's how we would then do a conceptual analysis and then determine what the function is, which we're going to be talking about, and then we would determine what intervention might best treat that issue. So now we're going to talk about strategies and supports, but first I'm going to give you your first secret code word, which is peanut butter. I will repeat, your first secret code word is peanut butter. So make sure you write that down, have it ready for when you submit for your CEUs so that you can get credit for attending this course. Okay, so let's talk about 5 important steps that we are going to highlight in today's training. Number 1, develop ideal sleep schedules. Number 2, routinize nighttime routines. Optimize bedroom conditions for number 3. Number 4, regularize sleep dependencies. And number 5, address sleep interfering behavior. Okay, so number 1, we're going to talk about developing an optimal sleep schedule. So these statistics and recommendations were taken from the National Sleep Association. So I'm just going to review them for you, and I have omitted the few for geriatrics, but if you're interested in that, you can look it up, and there's also statistics about above the age of 64. Okay, so for our intents and purposes, let's start with infants. So from 4 to 11 months, the sleep range widened 2 hours between 12 to 15 hours, but it was previously 14 to 15. So for toddlers years 1 to 2 years old, we have about 11 to 14 hours, which is recommended. And school-age children, preschoolers 3 to 5, 10 to 13 hours. Then we have school-age children from 9 to 11 hours is recommended. For teenagers, we have about 8 to 10 hours recommended. For younger adults, 18 through 25, we have 7 to 9 hours. And this is a new age category. And then we have adults where sleep range should be around 7 to 9 hours. So the next thing we want to consider when we're talking about developing a sleep schedule is to consider those forbidden zones. And so Greg Hanley talks about forbidden zones in his presentation about sleep, where he identifies them as forbidden zones that are times when it's near impossible to go to sleep and when you cannot go to sleep. So typically they're about 2 to 3 hours prior to when someone went to sleep the night before. So we advise us to recognize the universal tendency to go to bed later and to wake up later each 24-hour cycle. I know that might be a little confusing, but really what we're talking about here is think about those times for your learners, for your children, where it's just going to be impossible for them to go to sleep. And again, it's typically between 2 to 3 hours prior to when they went to sleep the night before. Just keep that in mind. So deciding on a schedule, very important in the first step. At the beginning of a sleep treatment, set the start of the sleep treatment slightly later when the child fell asleep the previous night. This isn't necessarily an intervention, but it is part of a future intervention we're going to be talking about called sleep fading. But right now, for the purposes of just considering how to decide on a schedule, what time seems appropriate for your learner to fall asleep? Consider when you're ready to start working on sleep to start it a little bit later than when they fell asleep the previous night, or a little later than what they're used to. In other words, you're putting a child to sleep an hour, 30 minutes to an hour after they've fallen asleep the night before. So as an example, if your child fell asleep at 9 o'clock on Thursday and you're going to start working on sleep and stabilizing it on Friday, then you're going to push it to a 10 o'clock bedtime. That's an example. And then you're going to gradually transition the sleep phase earlier. That is a really conservative example. There are some learners who fall asleep at midnight. So then you would start their sleep at 1 a.m. This is definitely not for the faint of heart. It is a difficult thing to be working on, so good for you to even be considering working on it or trying to gather some information on how to target sleep, because it can be challenging. But the goal is to gradually transition sleep phase earlier. So let's say we're talking about a 4-year-old. We can refer back to our really important sleep numbers here. And preschoolers who are between the age of 3 and 5 should be sleeping from 10 to 13 hours, right? So if we're deciding on a schedule and our child of interest is typically falling asleep around midnight, then we're going to want to push them forward to 1 a.m. and then gradually in 15-minute intervals try to get them to like that 8 o'clock, even 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock bedtime hour, right? So that they wake up for whatever time they need to get to school, so to avoid that sleepiness during the day. So if a child falls asleep within 15 minutes, move the bedtime earlier the next night. And we're going to talk more about this. Only move that schedule when the learner falls asleep within 15 minutes of the scheduled time. This is going to take about a week to get a desired bedtime schedule. And this is for those individuals who just don't have a schedule yet, who don't really have an ideal time or even a conservative time that they would like their learner to fall asleep, because things may be a little bit hairy right now. So this is a really good way to get you into a place of knowing, okay, I would love for my learner to fall asleep by 9 o'clock at night, but right now they're falling asleep around midnight at 1 a.m. How do we get them back to that ideal space? And that's deciding on a schedule. So here are some nighttime routine considerations. So when we develop a nighttime routine, we want to occasion behavioral quietude. And by that, we mean those bedtime behaviors or sleepy time behaviors. So try to implement a nighttime routine consistently across nights. It's not something that you're going to do on Monday and not do on Tuesday, maybe on Wednesday, didn't have time for it on Thursday. When you're working on sleep really intensely and trying to get a stabilized sleep schedule going, it's really important to keep things consistent and then fading that out as time goes on and as life happens. We want to have an emphasis prior to bidding goodnight. So thinking about those activities that progress from active to passive, we highly recommend to consider what our learners are doing right before bedtime. If we're looking at a sleep log and we're seeing 20 minutes before bed, a learner was on the trampoline, it's really obvious for us to be like, well, maybe that was more of an active activity, less than a passive activity, and that might have amped them up. So arrange choices on a picture schedule is going to be super helpful, and I'm going to have some examples coming up. So picture schedules or visual schedules are really helpful in keeping our learners on task, keeping them aware of what's coming next, and also giving them choice so they can arrange what activities they want to do in what order. Here on this slide, you see an example of a bedtime checklist. This is just one example of so many different versions of a visual schedule where a learner can check off their progress. But this isn't an example of where they can make choice. This is where you've set a schedule for them and that's what they're going to follow. But they can have options to arrange choices themselves to give them some autonomy and to hopefully motivate them to want to engage in these bedtime routines because they had choice in doing so. Again, you want to make those gradual changes in fun factor. You want to avoid rich or dense activities to barren or lean context in the environment. So what really that means is that you want to, at first when you're working on sleep, to make bedtime routine super, super fun. But you want to make it special, but that's not sustainable, right? So not every night is going to be fun and special. If it were, I don't know what our lives would look like, but most nights the expectation is you go to bed when you're tired. You don't have a circus or a singing dance to fall asleep. And these routines become more naturalistic for us, right? So we learn them, we do them kind of without thinking on autopilot. But for a lot of our learners, we have to start with a really, really intensely fun bedtime routine. And then the goal is to decrease how fun it is over time for sustainability purposes. Also consider baths earlier in the routine. We want body temperatures to be lower. So biologically, we sleep best when our body temperature is lower versus higher. Also consider ambient light that gets dimmer as bedtime is approaching. And of course, always consider if you're going to have a snack before bedtime, if your learner is going to have a quick snack, just avoid snacks with any caffeine. So Autism Speaks has an incredible resource page about sleep and different interventions you can try. I thought this was super important for us to include in here about routines and schedules. So from Autism Speaks perspective, these are some simple tips to a better bedtime routine. And this is just going to reiterate a little bit of what we've already discussed. So it should take place in the child's bedroom where it is quiet, other than bathing and teeth brushing and things like that that have to occur maybe in a bathroom or a different room. So bedtime routine should take place in a child's bedroom, and it should be quiet. Your child should be calm when the routine is done in the same order each night. Again, reiterating how important it is to have that expectant schedule for them to be following. And when we talk about your child should be calm, we just mean doing a little bit more of those passive activities, reading a book, doing some stretching, doing some maybe deep breathing, listening to some Enya, whatever floats your boat for a bedtime routine, but avoiding those activities that might be giving them more of like an amp up perspective. So young children or children with ASD may benefit from a visual schedule or to-do list like we've already talked about to help remind them of each step. So there are going to be visuals that are included in a few later slides, but from Autism Speaks, they suggest that it will help your child see that his or her bedtime routine will have the same events in the same order each night, and a visual schedule will also assist other family members and caretakers to follow that order in the routine in case that you need to do something that night and you need some help. And that will also help our learners to generalize this skill over to different people. Children who do not respond well to the use of a picture schedule may benefit from using objects, and each step in their routine may be captured by an object that is used in that step. So a toothbrush, a towel, a book, whatever it is that might signal more saliently for your learner what is coming next. Another really important thing is determining which events are calming and which are stimulating, like we already said, those passive versus active. Those events that are calming for your child should be part of your bedtime routine. Sometimes I call this like my wind down routine. So stimulating events should be moved to an earlier time in the evening. For example, if your child finds bathing super stimulating rather than relaxing, maybe move this event to an earlier time in the evening. So here are some examples of visual aids. So here on the left, we have an example of using a clock to kind of indicate which time. This might be for some more advanced learners, and this is something that can be super customizable for you and dependent on your family. But here's an example. We have dinner, playtime, bath time, put on clothes, watch a movie, brush teeth, go to the bathroom, lay in my bed, bedtime story, and sleep. And this can again be modified for whatever works for you and for your child. And then here's another example where we have bedtime routine pictures, not using a clock. And this is an example of where a learner you can cut these out and a learner can put them in order on their own menu of how they want to run their bedtime routine. But again, we'll have the same activities on it every night and we'll always end with going to bed. Here are some more examples that you can use. Again, these are customizable where you will just include whatever is super important for you and your family and for your learner to do prior to bedtime. But these activities should generally stay the same in the beginning, and then you can embed different things in there or fade out, the visual supports as needed. So here we have take a bath, take a shower, wash hair, put on pajamas, brush teeth, get a drink, go to bathroom, go to bed, go to sleep. And then we also have morning routine options. So if you find that a visual schedule or a visual aid is helpful in getting your learner to be on track, follow those tasks, and to consistently keep you as a parent or a caregiver or a therapist, however you're supporting a family, to keep you on track, also consider it for a morning routine. So here we have an example of wake up, go to the bathroom, get dressed, brush teeth, brush hair, eat, get ready, and it's time to go. And again, this is something that can be customizable for your learner. They can cut these out, put them on a menu, do them in an order that that is their own choice. But again, always kind of starting with waking up and ending with time to go. So another thing to consider is the environmental setup. So always consider your bedroom as the environment that the learner will be falling asleep in. So again, just to reiterate, cooler temperatures are more likely to occasion falling asleep than hotter temperatures, because biologically our body just responds better to being cooler, and therefore cooler represents being able to fall asleep a little bit easier, and that is why in the morning we wake up and our body temperature is elevated. Consider indirect lighting only. The brighter the room, the harder it might be to fall asleep. Non-undulating noise, some families prefer to use some noise machines, which are great if that's something you like. But if you are in a city or somewhere where there's lots of outdoor noise, you might want to consider different ways to kind of muffle that, and avoiding, any noise from a TV or something like that that might be stimulating in a way. And again, we always want to consider that toys and preferred activities are out of sight. It goes off of the out of sight, out of mind, but it also limits the motivation to stay awake and to play with those toys. And so we want to motivate our learners to sleep and then to wake up and have access to those items, which we will talk about as we continue. So here we're going to be talking about nighttime non-compliance. So there are some learners with a tendency to not follow instructions or to resist guidance, for example, to follow many of the steps that are involved in a sleep routine. So putting on PJs, brush teeth, or getting into bed in general. So we consider starting the routine just prior to the natural sleep phase. So, we would suggest starting if the natural sleep phase is a little bit later, around 10 o'clock, then maybe start around 9:45. Arrange big discrepancy in consequences for compliance versus non-compliance routine. So what we mean by that is that we want bedtime and wake time to have contrast. So we want our learners to understand that there is a specific consequence for following the direction of it's time to go to bed versus those non-compliance scenarios. So we want to give them special things. We want them to come in contact with reinforcement for compliance. And then for non-compliance, where we may withhold reinforcement or we just may have a different consequence in place. We will also want to highly promote instruction following during the day. So the goal is for it to generalize to bedtime routines. And here is an example of a tool that you can use, 10 compliance strategies for use in home by parents of young children. So really this will take you through different ways to practice those following instruction during the day routines so that those skills will generalize over to bedtime. So the more likely you present reinforcement in response to a child being compliant during the day, the goal is that the association will carry over to and generalize over to bedtime. So now we're going to be talking a little bit about sleep dependencies. So understanding sleep dependencies, what are they? So Autism Speaks talks heavily about why your children should fall asleep alone. And I think this is important to keep in there. So why should our children learn to fall asleep alone? Children and adults naturally wake up several times a night, right? It happens if you have a Fitbit, if you have a Whoop or something that tracks your sleep, and you can see data show that we move around during the night. REM sleep versus our being awake during the night. If we are restless during the night, all those things can be tracked to show that it's very rare to just sleep through the night without moving. Each time we wake up, we check out our environment and then quickly go back to sleep, right? Sometimes we do it unconsciously so. These wakings are so brief that we don't even remember them in the morning. If your child cannot fall asleep alone, then each time he or she wakes up, it is hard to fall asleep with or without your help. If your child learns to fall asleep alone, then he or she will also be able to learn to fall asleep alone if they wake up during the night naturally, and then wake more rested in the morning. So really what the message is that it can be okay if your learner wakes up in the middle of the night because it's natural for us to do so. However, it can be really challenging if your learner learns to fall asleep with you then if you need to go somewhere, if you need to leave the room or you're going to go back in your own bed and they wake up and you're gone, it can elicit some anxiety, it can elicit some concern, and generally the environment just looks different. So if a learner wakes up and it's the space is not the same as it was when they fell asleep, that can occasion some challenging behavior. So on the topic of sleep dependencies, it's really important to consider transitioning from relaxing bedtime routine to sleep depends on the things that are associated with falling asleep. So it depends on the things that we associate with sleep. Similarly, like the Autism Speak passage I read, is that we want to be careful with what sleep dependencies we put in place for our learners. So what is a sleep dependency? It's something, action, behavior, a stimuli without which you cannot fall asleep. Some people need a fan, some people need a TV or a sound machine or a lovey, whatever that might be. I know for myself, from the age, I think 2 to 18, I slept with a stuffed monkey that had a rattle in it. I took it with me to college. It was just something that I needed to have close by for me to help me fall asleep. And it worked. I never really had any issues falling asleep. If I didn't have it, I remember many different sleepovers I went to as a teenager. If I didn't have it, I was extremely distraught, and it definitely was harder for me to fall asleep. So understanding what our learners prefer to sleep with will help with those night awakenings. And it will help when those awakenings occur because they're associated with maybe a stimuli that is close by and something that they can feel safe with. And the reason I mention this is because those things that, like in this image, we have a lovey, we have a certain book, or we have a ball or something like that nearby. All of those things can be translated across environments, that can be taken to different places. But if you as the parent or caregiver or therapist is the sleep dependency, it's really hard to fade that out. So find items that occasion sleep that don't require your presence, can be there in the middle of the night, are transportable, can go on vacation with them or sleepovers. Eliminate or fade bad ones and replace them with good dependencies. So what we mean by that is a bad sleep dependency might be something like a parent, or might be something like a cell phone or an iPad, where it might be needed in a different place at that time. Or a parent might need to go do other things. You can't remain in the bedroom the whole night. So what we want to focus on is fading out those bad sleep dependencies and replace them with those good sleep dependencies that don't require presence and can remain there in the middle of the night and are transportable. And we do that by using a pairing procedure, in which if I were the parent who was a bad sleep dependency, I would then bring in something super special like a soft pillow or a soft toy, a nightlight or something super special for my learner, to then pair myself with that item and then slowly fade myself out. Sometimes it is recommended to go cold turkey and implement good sleep dependencies right from the jump, because the fading process can be effortful and it can take longer. But going cold turkey can occasion challenging behavior, so that disclaimer is important to put out there. So number 4, we're talking about addressing interfering behaviors. So interfering behaviors are those that prevent, delay, or interfere with falling asleep. These can include leaving the bed, crying, calling out from their bedroom, playing in their bedroom, talking to oneself. Those are just a few. It's not an exhaustive list, but they're the most common interfering behaviors that we see associated with bedtime. Be sure to first properly consider what the likely reinforcers or functions for those interfering behaviors are. We did highlight this a little bit earlier in the example I gave with a learner who had delayed onset sleep. So we're thinking, what is the function of these interfering behaviors? Do they want more attention? Do they want less attention? Are they seeking food or drink or other tangibles and access to fun things? Are they trying to escape or avoid the darkness of their bedroom? Or is it automatically reinforcing for them to engage in these interfering behaviors, like maybe talking to themselves, engaging in stereotypic behavior, there's a variety of different things that our learners like to do when no one's around, because it feels good to do so. And those are what we would consider automatic reinforcers. They don't require us, they don't require tangibles, they don't require anything but a learner in their own body and space. So first, we recommend provide a presumed reinforcer prior to bidding the child goodnight, especially an hour before the goodnight bid. So for an example, if I'm working with a learner who I've determined that the function of them avoiding sleep is because they want to play with a certain parent, and that parent was at work all day, and they're requesting more time with the parent, they're engaging in tantrum behavior at the onset of bedtime, what I would recommend is the function of that behavior is access to attention from a specific parent. So I would then say, okay, that parent has to dedicate 30 to 20 minutes of special time with that learner to fill their cup, to give them access to that reinforcer prior to bidding goodnight. Then, after you bid goodnight, eliminate access to the presumed reinforcer following the interfering behaviors. So what that means is we would then suggest downgrading as much attention as possible from that parent or from both parents if any challenging behavior occurs at bedtime. And the reason for that is we don't want to inadvertently reinforce those challenging behaviors with access to one of those reinforcers. So another example of this is if a learner is avoiding bedtime with the function of wanting to play with their toys, give them all the toys an hour before bedtime, fill that cup, have them satiate on those toys, and then when it's time for bed, those toys go away and the access to those toys is removed. So with socially mediated interfering behaviors, some options include extinction. And so in that example with a parent, we would say, you're not then going to go back in. We're not going to reinforce those behaviors. So you're not going to give the reinforcer anymore for that behavior. Another way of talking about it is calling it progressive weighting or graduated extinction. So this is the Ferber methodology, and it's waiting before you go in. So you're not completely letting them cry it out, but you are putting some boundaries on when you're willing to go in. So with this example, you're going to be spending increasingly longer amounts of time ignoring cries and protests at bedtime. But you're going to be doing periodic check-ins based on the parent's comfort level of how long they're willing to hear their child cry. It could be 15 seconds, it could be 3 minutes, it can be whatever number you determine with a family of what they're willing to do. And then you're just going to gradually increase how long the parent removes themselves. And we're going to talk more about what the logistics of this really are. But this is an example of how you address those challenging and interfering behaviors. Here we go. So graduated extinction. Here are the steps needed. You're going to follow the procedure for established bedtime routine first, whatever that looks like for the family. You'll need to have a way to close the door to a child's room, and that's going to be up to the family if they want to leave it open, if they want to put a child lock or a safety lock on it. That's going to have to be determined prior to trying this. Establish and be firm about a bedtime. So if you've established your routine, if you've established your schedule, and that schedule is, I want bedtime routine to start at 8:30, then that means that that is the time that bedtime is going to start every day. Determine how long you can wait before checking on your learner. This is super important. There are many instances where parents are super willing at first to do graduated extinction to work on reducing those interfering behaviors, but then when they're in it, it can feel really icky and uncomfortable, right? Because you're listening to your child cry, it's eliciting a lot of feelings, and it can be really hard. But I want to give everyone permission that it doesn't need to be a long interval. It can be 3 seconds. It can be 1 second. However you feel comfortable to be out of the room, the goal is to then slowly increase how long you're willing to be out of the room. So if on night 1, you're willing to be out of the room for 5 seconds in the first try, you're going to say, okay, I can do this. Say goodnight to your learner, leave the room, count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go back in, say it's time for bed, and leave the room again, and then increase it to 6 seconds, 7 seconds, whatever you're comfortable with. Pick the night to begin this plan, assuming no one will have a good night's sleep that evening. That is hard too. So I don't recommend starting a sleep intervention on a Monday. I highly recommend trying it on a Friday because then it gives you the weekend to hopefully recalibrate and hopefully come in contact with some success. On the first night, you will put your child to bed, you'll leave the room and wait on the agreed upon time. If after that time, and in this example I used 3 minutes, if your learner is still crying, you'll go into the room, you won't pick them up, you won't give them any food or drink unless medically needed, of course. You're not going to engage extensively, you're going to downgrade that attention. You're going to say it's time to go back to bed, and then you're going to leave. And you're going to wait the agreed upon time and repeat until the learner is asleep. And on subsequent nights, you're going to extend the time between visits by 2 or 3 minutes and continue the same procedure when entering the room. Here's another example of something you can do, what we call time-based visiting. So parents will go into the room based on a time schedule, not based on progressively waiting for a child's behavior, and you're going to increase the time between visits. Visiting a child at increasingly longer intervals after a bidding goodnight across nights, hopefully before interfering behavior occurs. During visits, retuck them in, bid goodnight, and leave. So for an example, visit 1 is 10 seconds, visit 2 is 30 seconds, visit 3 is 1 minute, and you're increasing how long you're willing to be outside of the room, similar to the graduated extinction. And here's just an example, night 1, night 2, night 3. So here's another example of bedtime fading. This is something that we're going to be talking about later, and this is a recommended procedure by Mark Durand, who wrote a lovely book called Sleep Better, and we're going to talk about that book later in our presentation. So with bedtime fading, you're keeping the child up so late that they naturally fall asleep on their own. The goal is to fade back bedtime in small increments until ideal bedtime. So this really talks more about like when you're establishing your sleep schedule. This is what we were talking about when we were discussing ways to do that. So what you need to do, select a bedtime based on what we would call a sleep diary, which is a tool that you can use to kind of help you determine a schedule that the learner is likely to fall asleep with little difficulty and within 15 minutes. Then we suggest to add 30 minutes to that time. So an example. Diary indicates that learner fell asleep naturally around 11 p.m. The new bedtime is 11:30. If learner falls asleep within 15 minutes of being put to bed at the new bedtime and without any challenging behavior or resistance for 2 nights in a row, move the bedtime by 15 minutes backwards. That's what we mean by bedtime fading. Keep learner awake before the new bedtime, even if they seem like they want to fall asleep. If the learner does not fall asleep within 15 minutes of the new bedtime, have the learner leave the bedroom and extend the bedtime for 1 more hour. Continue to move up the bedtime until desired bedtime is achieved. And this is a suggestion for those learners who aren't necessarily trying to engage in any interfering behavior. They're just not falling asleep when you're asking them to fall asleep, and they don't really have a schedule. So this is a really good strategy for those learners. So here are some pros and cons of the 2 strategies we just discussed. So here we have bedtime fading. A pro of bedtime fading, where you're slowly keeping them up and you're working based off of their naturalistic sleep patterns. It can often be errorless with no increase in behavioral issues, and it often avoids long bouts of crying. So those are some pros. Some cons. It requires someone to remain awake late at night, and it can take several weeks before a desired outcome. I think it's important to always have your pros and cons available because, again, sometimes things sound really great on the surface level, but then once you're in it, it can be really uncomfortable and really tough to continue. And the biggest mistake you can make with an intervention is agreeing on one, trying it, and quitting halfway through, because then you have to start over, and then in a way you've kind of inadvertently taught something that you weren't able to be consistent with. So I would much rather you choose something you can be comfortable and consistent with than something you feel like sounds good but might not be feasible. Another example of pros and cons. So graduated extinction. Graduated extinction is when you're going to be out of the room longer. So Pros can be, it can be implemented at an ideal bedtime instead of having to wait until learner falls asleep. You can check on your child for reassurance during those times, and it can show results quicker than other options. Some cons: requires listening to learner crying, which can be difficult, can result in an uptick in interfering or challenging behaviors that are hard or unsafe to ignore. And that is definitely a common occurrence when you use any form of extinction, right? So when you're removing access to a reinforcer that used to be readily available, we may see what we call an extinction burst. So you may see a learner kind of pull out some new behaviors and go on the bell curve where they're pulling out some new behaviors. What are they doing? They're jumping out of their crib. They've never done that before. And these might be too unsafe and hard to ignore. And so that is a con to this type of intervention. But if you can put things in place that might be able to prevent that, or you just downgrade your own attention and you follow through with the protocol as best as you can. Some other strategies to consider are quality fading. So identify all the rewarding features of your nightly interactions and gradually decrease the quality of them across nights. So that's what we meant when I was talking about, downgrading those reinforcers. At first, they have to come in super hot. They have to have a really, really effective punch and be motivating. And then you're slowly gonna fade the quality of those reinforcers and access to those reinforcers to get to a more naturalistic, sustainable sleep schedule. Something you also can use is a bedtime pass. So with a bedtime pass, you're going to give a child a bedtime pass to be used as needed after the bid goodnight to have one request granted. If you don't use it, you get an extra contingency next day or the morning. So if they don't use it, they get something super fun the next morning. If the number of interfering behaviors was high before you tried this treatment, provide more than one bedtime pass initially and then fade out the number each night. And with a bedtime pass, it can be exchanged for whatever it is that you're finding to be the most common occurrence or request at night. So it can be a visit from a parent, a drink of water, a nighttime hug, kiss, one more book, play with my toy for one more minute, whatever that is. But that means that once that bedtime pass is used, that's it. And you have to be willing to leave the room and not give any more access to those reinforcers. And then the next morning, they don't get anything extra special, but what they're learning is to, instead of engaging in challenging behavior, they can use a bedtime pass to request for their needs or omit using it and get something special in the morning. And another strategy is what we call person fading, which is when you sleep near but not in the child's bed and then gradually increase the physical distance between adult and child at night. So an example of that is on night 1, you're sleeping right next to their bed, maybe your hand is on their back. Night 2, you're sleeping right next to them, maybe your hand is on the bed. Night 3, you're sleeping next to them, your hand isn't near them. Night 4, you're 3 feet away. Night 5, you're 6 feet away. Night 6, you're in the doorway. Night 7, you're outside the door, and hopefully by night 8 and night 9, you're outside of the room and or in your own bed. So that is an example of that as well. Here are some visual strategies to consider. Here's a wind down chart, which I think is super cool, where a learner can check off how they were winding down Monday through Sunday. And some examples is they took a bath, they put on their pajamas, they brushed their teeth, used the potty, read a book, lights out, and they stayed in bed until the morning. And this could be considered a reinforcement chart. And if they, let's say, were able to wind down successfully for 5 out of 7 nights, they get a special prize at the end of the week. And this is for those learners who may have more of a stabilized schedule and just need to be kept on a more maintained schedule. Or something like this might be a little bit more sustainable for families. And here's an example of a bedtime pass. It can be used for one more snuggle, kiss, cup of water, extra tuck-in. So again, we are going to just review again how to address those interfering behaviors that produce their own reinforcements. Those are those automatic reinforcers, those things that happen because they feel good or fit that sensory component. So If a learner is more likely to engage in those behaviors automatically and they're not socially mediated, they're not for an item or an activity, we would suggest providing presumed reinforcer prior to bidding the child goodnight. So if an example is a learner really likes to spin a pinwheel toy. It's something that they're super motivated by. They like to look at it, or they like to spin in circles themselves, or maybe engage in some hand flapping or some echolalia. We would say give them time and space to do that. And then part 2, after bidding goodnight, we would suggest putting in some sort of a rule or using one of these strategies below. So you're going to relocate those relevant materials. You're going to sweep the room for those high stim items. You may then block them from engaging in any of those automatically reinforcing behaviors. Some of them might be SIB, so you might want to block those using RIRD, which is a blocking procedure where you're going to redirect, intersperse, and then you're going to redirect to doing something else for those vocal stereotypy learners. And then again, really important though, allowing STEM zones and STEM time. So what we mean by that is, for some of our learners, it might be self-soothing for them to engage in self-talk at bedtime. If you're okay with it, I'm okay with it, as long as they know that that's okay to do in their own space. If it's keeping them up for a long time at night, that's going to be on you to make an objective decision on what you think is impeding them falling asleep and avoiding that behavioral quietude. Again, now we're going to be talking about addressing night awakenings. So night awakenings should be resolved with an appropriate sleep schedule and healthy sleep dependencies. But if not, there are some additional things that can be put in place, like using something like a moon or sun clock and daytime discrimination training. And all of those things can teach a learner of what time it's okay to get up in the morning and what time they have to stay in bed until. So for a moon or sun clock, they change color when a learner is allowed to get out of bed or leave their room. And that can be a really salient way to teach a learner to discriminate when it's time to get up or when they should stay in bed. And then if night awakenings are still really happening, we would potentially schedule awakenings in the nighttime. So we would suggest to wake your child about 15 to 30 minutes prior to their night awakening from the night before. So if they woke up around 2:30 the night before, we would say wake them up at 2:15, and then gradually increase the schedule of awakening until it coincides with morning wake up. This can be hard, but the reason we suggest that is because you technically want to beat them to the punch. You want to wake them up before they wake up on their own. And it also can be really helpful to address those nighttime incontinence. Kiddos who are having accidents at night, urine or BM accidents, and you're working on toilet training, this could be a great way to work on that in tandem with sleep. So here are some takeaway points for everyone to think about. It's really, really important to adhere to an agreed sleep schedule that is sensitive to age and recent sleep history. Adherence to nighttime routines and sleep contexts that foster compliance and behavioral quietude. It's important to consider the development of sleep contingencies on things that are routinely and easily present throughout the night and, of course, are transportable. And experience with a clear discrepancy between what is available during the day versus the night. So something that's really helpful is something we call the Good Sleep Habits Checklist. So this is taken from the book Sleep Better by Mark Duran. And here are some components to keep in mind when you are figuring out what works for you and for your learner. So again, super important to have a set bedtime routine. Develop a regular bedtime and regular wake time. Even if you're in the middle of a pandemic and life is strange, it is encouraged to develop a regular bedtime and regular wake time. Eliminate all foods and drinks that contain caffeine 6 hours before bedtime. Try drinking milk before bedtime for those learners who can drink milk. Eat a well-balanced diet, minimal fatty foods. Do not exercise or participate in physical activity in the hours before bedtime. Do include exercise throughout the day and week. Reduce noise and light in the bedroom. Reserve bed for bedtime story and sleeping and not for playtime. And again, avoid extreme temperature changes in the bedroom, too hot or too cold. So here's another supplemental material, something that we call a sleep log. This is just one example of one that is available. And when you are attempting to do a sleep intervention, it can be super helpful to just put your thoughts and what's going on into a sleep log like this. So in this example, you would put the date, you would put what your bedtime routine activities were: brush teeth, put on pajamas, take a bath, read a book, whatever that is, the time you put your learner to sleep, the time they fell asleep, what time they woke up in the morning, and consider the daily activity level. Was it a mild day? Did they go outside for 5 minutes? Was it a moderate day? Did they have an APE lesson or do something for about 30 minutes a day? Or was it intense? Were they out all day, lots of walking, lots of park time? And any additional notes that might be helpful in understanding how the night went. And here are some references for you guys to access and that were part of this presentation. And here is our resource page. Here are some really great different resources to consider when you're thinking about doing sleep or sleep training. From Autism Speaks, they have an entire page and a parent guide for strategies to improve sleep in children with autism spectrum disorders. Sleep Better by Mark Duran, who I mentioned a few times. And then Mary Barbera, who is also a behavior analyst, who wrote Stop Playing Musical Beds, Solving Sleep Problems in Children with and Without Autism. These are all things to consider for you to do on your own time. And before we leave, I want to give you your last secret code word, and that code word is Baxter, B-A-X-T-E-R. It is the name of my dog. So that is your last code word of the day. I hope that this training was really helpful for anyone who was watching. And remember, those 2 code words are super important if you are looking for CEU credits. Thank you again on behalf of ELS for Autism. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me at marissa.eck@elsforautism.org. Thank you so much. Have a great day.